Wellington Trust. You are all very welcome indeed. I'm sorry about the awful technical problems that come in. This is a lecture which is organised through the auspices of the Wellington Trust by the Friends of the Wellington Trust. And we welcome all those in the Wellington Trust, and we've extended it to a far wider circle of friends now, including the wardens and liverymen of the Honourable Company Master Mariners, members of the Anchorite Seven Seas Naval Club, Army and Navy and In and Out clubs, friends of the National Museum of the Royal Navy, the Maritime Foundation, the Nautical Institution, the Royal Institution of Navigation, the Company of Watermen and Lightermen. Eric, good evening to you. Calshot's International Chamber of Shipping, the Society of Nautical Research, the Worshipful Company of Shipwrights. You're all very welcome to our very closely affiliated organisation. And last but by no least, I very warmly welcome my ward club in the City of London, the Ward of Cheap Club, and their president, Mr. Charles Ledson. Very welcome to you. Finally, apart from Robin Payne in New Zealand, and possibly if he's there, Paul Kenley, if he's got himself out of his steaming pit in time, in Auckland, we do welcome those from New Zealand. Robin, well done for being on board. And finally, and by no means least, I welcome my friend, Captain Ted van Brunswick, from Sydney in New South Wales. If he is on, Sydney, Ted is the
Wellington, New Zealand.
Federal Master of the Company of Master Mariners. He is the opposite number to the Honourable Company Master Mariners Master in Australia, and you're all very welcome. Now, if I may move on, there's a little bit of housekeeping, hopefully, which I will be able to do. There's me. We are doing all our lectures on Zoom, provided next time it behaves itself in future. For those who know, the friends, etc., who have come to these lectures, we tend to have these lectures once a month over the winter months, and we have them on board the good ship Wellington. But obviously we are closed now for COVID reasons, and therefore we have extended, and I think it is magnificent that we have 94 people on this event. I'm so grateful to you all coming and making it so worthwhile. For those who haven't muted, if you could please mute your button, except for you, Hannah, bless you, because I think you're going to speak to us in a minute. And Jenny, you're going to keep yours on as well. And Matt, in case we have more technical problems, and I think we've had our belly full for tonight, would you like to keep yours on as well? This lecture is being recorded. The lecture will go on to our website at the headquarters ship Wellington, if you'd like to find that. But also after this lecture, we will be sending you, Matt, I think this is right, a link so you can find your way to the recording if you'd like to do it. I can promise you it doesn't have the first 20 minutes of confusion. Hannah is welcoming questions and will attempt to answer. I'm sure we'll do very well. The way we're going to do this, because there's so many of you, to start with anyway, is you will have a chat button, which hopefully you will find on your screen. And where it says chat, at the bottom, you have the ability to be able to type in a message. You'll see just above it, there's a pull down bar, and it says to everyone with a pull down bar. Don't bother to pull down the pull down bar. Just type in your message, your question there. I've got 44,795 people entering the waiting room. I think probably not is the answer. That was an interesting message. So for any question, anytime during the talk, if you'd like to put in your question, and I'm going just to say question here. So there you are, you can see me. It'll be recorded. And Jenny Mosley, our marketing trustee. I wonder if someone could turn off their mute button. I'm getting some chat back just there from someone. Okay. And Jenny will do that, and we'll select some questions. But hopefully from now, it's going to be inside the hour by the time we say goodbye to you, because we've already been keeping you waiting long enough. With that, with no more ado, I would have great pleasure in introducing, if I can move. Oh, Eric's in there. Let's let him in. Good evening, Eric. Welcome on board. Jenny, I am just going to give control to Hannah. Hannah should now have control and be able to move on your cursor left or right. Do you just want to try that? I'm sorry we didn't have a chance to do that beforehand.
Alistair, you've got 2 more slides first.
Okay, that's fine, but I just want to actually test to make sure it's happening. I've got David Hogman drawing all over my screen with a red pen at the moment, which is quite interesting. There we are, it's moving. We have great pleasure in welcoming Hannah Cunliffe, who is the Director of National Historic Ships UK. This is an organisation that was set up with government funding in, I believe, about 2006. It might have been earlier in its previous existence. And the NHS UK is a government-funded independent organisation which gives objective advice to UK governments and local authorities, funding bodies, and the historic ship sector on all matters relating to historic vessels in the UK. Now, Hannah has been a director of National Historic Ships UK since 2017. She was working for the organisation for 10 years previously to that. She has a master's in maritime history at the University of Greenwich, and she has been working as a freelance maritime researcher and consultant before that. The interesting bit, and Hannah, maybe you can tell us a bit about this, is your life spent on the Bristol Channel pilot cutter with your father, who was the very renowned, I think it was Ted Cunliffe is his name, is that right?
Tom Cunliffe.
Tom Cunliffe, I'm so sorry, Tom Cunliffe. And now she's sailing around the Solent with her husband in the 1909 Gaffrig yawl. Jim Spencer, if you're listening, can you take careful note of that, please? So you hail her next time you sail past her, Chichester Harbour. The subject of today's lecture is maritime heritage in the UK, achievements and challenges around our coast. I hope, Hannah, you have control of your of the slides now. And without more ado, I'll hand over to you with many thanks.
Lovely. Thanks very much, Alistair. Good evening, everybody. Thank you all for joining me on what is not just a first for Wellington, but actually a first for me. I've taken part in plenty of Zoom lectures, Zoom meetings, as you might imagine, over the last few months. I've also chaired a few, but this is the very first lecture. So if the technology or the delivery is a little bit rusty, please bear with me. And to that end, I'm just going to try and move a slide forward or back.
If not, we can...
Yeah, so I don't seem to, it says that I have control, Alistair, but it doesn't want to go forward or back.
It has
so
been very reluctant this evening. It's not behaving as it should do.
we may have our first technical hitch.
Yeah. Would you like to say next, and I'll run you through the slides?
Okay, no problem. So it's a number of years since I was last on board Wellington, although we've actually held our annual award ceremony there quite a few times. However, I just wanted to recall a personal memory when I actually attended a dinner of the anchorites, which Alistair referred to earlier, in the company of my father. And for those of you who aren't familiar with this group, I know we do have some members with us, but for others, the Anchorites is a club which I believe was formed in 1919, Alistair, do correct me, for the promotion of good fellowship among those interested in maritime affairs. And on my visit, it was actually ladies' night. And I recall a tradition where the guest who gave the best introduction of their female partner was awarded a glass of port, which she then had to stand and drink to great cheers from all those present. My father, as Alistair has said, is a bit of a renowned narrator, and he promptly told a very good yarn with some tall tales about my childhood afloat, and scored the port. So I was the lucky recipient, and yeah, it's stuck in my mind ever since. Now, modern technology is amazing, but I'm afraid not even the wonders of Zoom can run to a glass of port all round tonight. So I do hope that you have well charged your glasses while you were in the waiting room, and you're all set now for the lecture to start. Having signed up, I'm sure most of you are pretty familiar with some of the challenges a historic vessel can face. However, as an organisation which offers advice to over 2,000 craft, you can imagine that we're discussing these issues on a fairly regular, if not a daily basis at National Historic Ships. So tonight I'm going to take a look at some of the challenges in a bit more detail. And for the more observant among you, you may notice from the first slide that I've actually very slightly changed the title of tonight's talk. And this was really to make the point that the historic vessels we support are not only on our coastline, but can actually be found at any point across the country, whether it's an estuary, a lake, a river or a canal. And therefore, the new topic of tonight's talk is achievements and challenges around our coast and inland waterways. Could we have the next slide, please, Alistair?
We can if it moved. I think we have got, hang up again. Can you hold a second? I'm so sorry. Jenny, can you try the cursor? Thank you. That's good.
Thank you. So for those of you who don't know us already as an organisation, I'm going to start with a brief explanation about what National Historic Ships is and what we were set up to do. And then using vessel case studies, I'm going to go on to highlight some of the key challenges for our sector, have a look at the ways that National Historic Ships has helped vessel custodians deal with these, and then we'll finish on a slightly more positive note with a few success stories. Next slide, please. So back in 2006, National Historic Ships received funding from the Department for Digital Culture, Media and Sport, more commonly known as DCMS. And we're an advisory body set up to cover all matters relating to historic vessels in the UK. We raise awareness of our sector, deliver professional standards, promote traditional skills, and support vessel custodians in caring for their craft. Now, we're based primarily in offices at the National Maritime Museum in Greenwich, although we do cover the whole of the UK. And of course, at the moment, pretty much like everybody else, we're all working from home. And actually are lucky enough to be able to deliver about 95% of our services that way. Next slide, please. So moving on to our remit, what do we do? I'm not going to go into this in a huge amount of detail because it's all on our website. And I do hope that some of you, if not all of you, will take some time afterwards to go and visit there and have a browse. However, in a nutshell, our main focus is providing advice to government, including our funders at DCMS, typically answering parliamentary questions or giving data for freedom of information requests. But we also provide expert advice to funding bodies, such as the National Lottery Heritage Fund, on applications relating to historic vessels or maritime skills projects. And of course, we provide leadership and support across the whole historic vessels community. Next slide, please. And one of our principal activities is managing a set of databases known as the National Historic Ship Registers. And these currently list over 2,000 vessels. I'm just going to run through them very briefly. The primary database is the National Register of Historic Vessels, and any craft that meets our basic criteria is eligible to come onto that. So that is effectively that craft must be over 33 feet in length overall, over 50 years old, and that's a rolling criteria. So we do have new vessels coming onto the register every year. They must be based in UK waters, substantially intact, and of UK significance. And then from that register, we draw a subset called the National Historic Fleet. And these are currently about 200 vessels, which are considered of preeminent importance. They're the best surviving representatives of their type, and therefore they merit the highest priority in terms of conservation. We also have something called the National Archive of Historic Vessels. This is for craft that have been lost, sunk or destroyed, and allows us to make sure that a permanent record is kept of them in perpetuity. Our Overseas Watch List, or OWL as it's fondly known, is a way of keeping track of significant UK craft that are now based abroad. And then in relatively recent years, we created something called the UK Replica List, still very much in its infancy, but it allows us to keep an eye on traditional new builds and to categorise the skills that go into constructing them. Now, you'll recall that I said our primary database was for vessels that were over 33 feet in length. So we do work very closely with the National Small Boat Register, which is run by the National Maritime Museum, Cornwall, and they deal with everything below that length. So between us, we pretty much encapsulate the whole of maritime heritage in the UK. Next slide, please. So now moving on to the main topic of tonight's talk. On your screen, if the technology is working, you should see a summary of the key challenges that historic vessels in the UK face. Of course, there are others. This is just the list as I see it. It's the areas that we're most frequently called on to advise on, or aspects that I'm aware vessels have been lost as a result of. So what I'm going to do first is just very briefly run through each of these challenges. The first one is financial, obviously a very common one. So many people dealing with insufficient funds to conserve or operate a vessel, but also people with no means of successfully generating an income. Then we have organisational challenges. So there could be a problem with governance, perhaps poor management, or lack of trustees, or not the right trustees, and simply insufficient experience of running a historic vessel. Logistical challenges. So it's essential that a vessel has a secure long-term mooring, and without this, the vessel isn't safe. It may have difficulties operating, it's difficult to access it, and it won't be able to apply for funding. Then we have material challenges. So the vessel may be in need of conservation, probably or possibly at a level that the owner might consider unviable or the funder considers unviable. And of course, we also have maintenance issues. So the problems of funding these and the difficulties that maintenance can cause in terms of disruption to a vessel's schedule or opening hours. Operational challenges. Operating vessels need an infrastructure around them. They need the skills to maintain and operate them, the facilities to dry dock them, services to supply them, and without these, the vessel simply cannot survive. And then we have regulatory challenges. So vessels need to comply with the relevant legislation. In the UK, we have the Maritime and Coast Guard Agency regulations for operational passenger carrying craft, but there's also a range of access and safety restrictions, which also apply to static and museum vessels if they're open to the public. Natural challenges. So this is something a bit different, but vessels are as much at risk of these as any other heritage asset. And with increasing concerns about climate change, I fear that they're only likely to be more so. Now, when I first wrote this talk, which was actually a few years ago, I thought that I'd covered all of the main challenges and I stopped there. However, when reviewing it ahead of tonight, I realised that, of course, there is one other area we need to think about. And I've called it the challenge of the unforeseen. I very much doubt that many ships have had a global pandemic listed on their risk assessment before this year. And very few of us could have anticipated the events we would all be facing. However, of course, COVID-19 has had a significant impact on historic ships, which, like so many other sectors, have had to cease their operations and close their doors at the height of the busy summer season, leading to major financial problems and in some cases also material issues if conservation has had to be put on hold. So therefore, the unforeseen. So that's kind of the main challenges that I've identified. But finally, we do need to consider sustainability, because however much people want a vessel to survive, and even if they've overcome all the other challenges on my list, if they have no sustainable business plan or long-term use in place for that vessel, then it has no viable future, and all their efforts to save it will have been in vain. So now I'm going to look at some case studies which will illustrate each of these challenges. And you'll notice that in some cases, the vessel may only meet with one of these challenges, but in a lot of cases, they're actually dealing with multiple issues. Okay, could we have the next slide, please? So first of all, we've got financial and organisational challenges. Next slide. And the vessel example that I've chosen here is MV Wincham. Now, this vessel is actually on the National Archive of Historic Vessels now, rather than the main register, because she was sadly lost due to the financial and organisational challenges that hit her. She was a Weaver packet built in 1948, a small motor cargo vessel, and she was tragically scrapped over an Easter holiday weekend in 2012 for works that actually amounted initially only to £15,000, then rising to 40,000 over a 3-year period. So actually very small sums in relation to a typical conservation project. At National Historic Ships, we were first made aware of her situation on Maundy Thursday, and by Bank Holiday Monday, only 3 days later, she had already had the knife taken to her. So if we go to the next slide, I will show you what she looked like then. So it's a real tragedy, and whilst the financial costs were in no way unsurmountable, she was actually facing organisational challenges, and her governance really needed a renewal of passion and energy in order to overcome the situation, and without this she just couldn't be saved. Next slide, please. Operational vessels face other forms of financial challenges in order to generate enough income to continue working. So the paddle steamer Waverley is a good example of this. She cruises annually around the coast of the UK, carrying large numbers of passengers, but meeting her ongoing maintenance costs and marketing her successfully is a regular issue for her ownership body. And she's actually needed constant support over the years, starting with a £7 million rebuild back in 2002 to 3, which took her back to her original 1947 condition. More recently, she's actually received £1 million from the Scottish government as part of a major appeal where she was seeking actually 2.3 million in total in order to install new boilers and return her back into service. Now, impressively, the organisation which runs her did manage to achieve that target in just 7 months. However, with an operational vessel like Waverley, obviously material and moving parts are constantly being eroded. And there's no doubt that she's going to be running many more fundraising campaigns of that nature in the years ahead, if she is to survive. Next slide, please. Waverley's operating body, the Paddle Steamer Preservation Trust, also made the difficult decision some years ago to focus their energies on only one vessel. And so the passenger ferry Balmoral, built in 1949, which was previously in their ownership, separated out and a new trust was formed to manage her. And after several years of hard work, successful fundraising appeals and sponsorship, Balmoral ended up with a very bad season in 2017, which actually ended up with her removal from service. So she faced poor weather, which cancelled her sailings. There was a collapse of the Gravesend landing pontoon, which took the Thames visit off her programme. She had last-minute refusal of permission to land at the Isle of Man. And she also faced the unforeseen challenges with engine problems and a rope around the propeller. And as a result, she actually managed less than half of her scheduled sailings that season. So as a result, she came home to a financial challenge. But this was then made even worse by a regulatory challenge when the MCA refused to reissue her passenger carrying certificate due to the condition of her hull and the level of replating they believe was required. And then this also brought with it an immediate logistical problem, as if the ship wasn't going to be operational, she actually needed a secure all year round berth in Bristol Harbour, while plans were put in place to raise the necessary funds. Balmoral has remained out of commission for the last 3 years, but the Trust has worked really hard to establish her as a successful static exhibit in Bristol Harbour, pending securing the necessary money to complete the works and return her to operation. Next slide, please. Now, the small collection of historic vessels, until recently based in Southampton docks, is a prime example of craft facing logistical issues in terms of mooring. So I'm going to look at them next. Associated British Ports, which run Southampton docks, decided a few years ago that they needed the dock space where the historic vessels were for other matters, and the vessels were given notice to move. which resulted in changes of ownership, funding appeals, and actually also a declaration of intent to deconstruct. Next slide, please. The light vessel 78 was one of the craft affected. Built in 1914 by Thornycroft of Southampton for Trinity House, she spent many years guarding Calshot Spit at the entrance to Southampton Water. And when she came out of service, she was then put on static display in one of the town marinas before actually ending up eventually at the Ocean Liner Terminal in the docks in 2010. But with ABP's announcement, she needed a new home, and she was eventually relocated successfully to the Solent Sky Museum in the city earlier this year. And you can see her in this slide actually holding up the traffic very early one morning. And so she's now sitting adjacent to the museum building, where the plan is that she will eventually become an exhibit and a cafe facility. Next slide, please. The Dunkirk Little Ship and the Steam Tug Challenge that you can see here was also part of the group facing eviction from Southampton docks. Built in 1931, Challenge is the last surviving example of a large purpose-built Thames ship handling tug with a triple expansion steam engine. And having been conserved with the National Lottery Heritage Fund grant under the care of the Dunkirk Little Ships Restoration Trust, she now needed a new home for the next phase of her life. Now, this proved pretty difficult to achieve on two levels. Firstly, organisationally, so in terms of finding the right owner with the skills and a viable future vision, and also logistically, so securing an interim or long-term berth that was going to work for her in terms of being affordable with public access and also on a safe site. And actually another added difficulty in a case like this is the fact that the terms of the lottery grant, which had grant aided her conservation, were still in place. And so these actually needed to be passed on to any new putative owner who needed to agree to accept those. So it was a tricky situation. And there was a huge amount of research and effort by the trust that had restored her, looking at every possible option from an alternative home in the UK to actually taking her abroad to a museum in Turkey. But eventually a new owner was secured earlier this year, and Challenge has now moved to the East Coast. And actually you can see her here on Hythe Slipway, where she had some sort of major overhauling before she went into her new ownership. Next slide, please. So the other vessel affected by ABP's ultimatum was the tug tender Calshot. She was built in 1936 and has a long association with the Port of Southampton, serving some of the great ocean-going liners. And poor Calshot has faced multiple problems in terms of location, conservation, funding, not to mention long-term sustainability. And in 2018, a declaration of intent to deconstruct Calshot was published on the National Historic Ships website in conjunction with the trust that owns her, because they simply felt they had no alternative, having struggled for many years to secure funding for her. Now, at this point, I just want to pause and clarify what is meant by a declaration of intent to deconstruct, because I know that for many, it's automatically assumed to be a death knell for a ship. Owners tend to resist this route at all costs, even if there's no other option on the table. But actually, from the National Historic Ships point of view, it's very much embedded in our guidelines on recording and deconstruction. And in those circumstances, we actually see it as a positive action, which can offer the last chance of finding a solution for a vessel before scrapping takes place. So publishing that statement of intent will actually explain the plight to the wider sector, raise the profile of the vessel, and highlight her significance in the press, just to make sure that every possible avenue has been explored. Now, in the case of Calshot, publishing the intent to deconstruct did result in renewed local enthusiasm for the ship. However, she currently remains on borrowed time in Southampton docks, and she's now at high risk with no firm future plan in place. Next slide, please. So moving on, we're going to have a look next at material challenges. Next slide. And Admiral Nelson's flagship from the Battle of Trafalgar, HMS Victory, is a great example of the scale of works which some vessels face. So Victory's been displayed in dry dock in Portsmouth since 1922, when it was discovered quite recently that her hull was sagging and moving at a rate of 0.5 centimetres a year. So clearly a new way had to be found of supporting her quite urgently. Laser scanning was carried out of the hull to identify the key stress points as part of a £50 million major conservation programme. And actually this August, the new support system was unveiled with 134 props now successfully installed around the ship and the old cradle cut away. And each of those new props has a load cell, which allows the Victory team to actually measure minute by minute any future movement to the hull. So this is a massive step forward. However, in the case of Victory, stabilising the hull is really only the beginning of this massive conservation project. Scaffolding's now being installed on the starboard side of the ship, and that's prior to tackling conservation of the top sides, which is the next phase of the physical works to the ship to stop water ingress. Next slide, please. On a much smaller scale, we have something completely different here. This is the 34-foot barge yacht Growler, which you can see undergoing reconstruction work in Norfolk to return her to operational use as a sail cargo vessel. And this work is being carried out personally by her teenage owner in a field attached to his family home. And he's keeping the overheads as low as possible. However, he's already taken, I think, 2 years on the project, and the effort, hard work and determination that's gone into this vessel renders it a major conservation project in its own right. Next slide, please. And material challenges can actually apply as much to maintenance issues as to long-term conservation work. Here on this slide, we have the National Historic Fleet vessel, the Five Feet Swan. She's built in 1900, and you can see her here on a visit to Greenwich, although actually she's more regularly out and about around the Shetland Isles where she's based. She's a fully operational traditional vessel, and she's run by a trust offering charter and day trips throughout the summer, and then cared for by a team of volunteers all winter long. Now, this year's winter project for the volunteers was a complete overhaul of her 28-foot long bowsprit, which had developed some nasty splits. And obviously with any maintenance issue, there's the fear that it's going to be very costly or that the particular part might need to be completely replaced, and then that would knock the vessel out of operation. However, in this case, it was not as bad as they feared. It turned out that there was no rot in the bowsprit itself, and they were able to scarf in some fillets to effect a neat solution to the problem. Next slide, please. Okay, so the next thing on our list of challenges is operational and regulatory challenges, which can often but not always go hand in hand. Next, please. And here we have the passenger ship SS Shieldhall. For those of you who don't know this vessel, she was originally built as a sewage disposal vessel for the Clyde, although carrying passengers at the same time. Interesting combination. And she's a good way of illustrating, for the purposes of this lecture, the extreme operational challenges that some vessels face today. And she's successfully managed by a team of dedicated volunteers based on Solent, and they've put together a carefully chosen cruising programme around the Isle of Wight, which makes her a viable entity. But her whole future is regularly jeopardised by the difficulty of finding a suitable facility to dry dock her. So there are no dry docks open to a vessel of this size, a historic vessel of this size on the south coast anymore. So this means that the Shieldhall has to make a regular journey of 160 nautical miles down to Falmouth in the West Country just to maintain her passenger carrying certificate. And of course that's costly in terms of fuel, difficult in terms of securing the volunteer labour to make the journey, and there's also a risk factor taking a significant historic vessel out to the open sea. Next, please. And the lack of infrastructure is not the only challenge facing operational craft. Increasing regulations can have an impact not just on their ability to continue running, but also potentially on their significance. Some years ago, the 1926 built Brixham trawler Vigilance was informed that she could no longer display her original fishing number painted on her bulwarks where it had always been, because there was a danger of confusion with modern day fishing craft. And as you can imagine, this caused a lot of debate and dialogue, but eventually on this occasion, a compromise was reached and she was allowed to keep the number. And if you can see, might be a bit tricky on the slides, but there's a thin diagonal red line that goes through the fishing number, and that was acceptable because that indicates that she's no longer actively fishing. Next slide, please. Regulatory issues are not always that easily resolved, and in fact last year a more threatening issue reared its head for a number of historic craft, with the introduction by the Maritime and Coast Guard Agency of a series of new safety standards for older ships. Amongst other changes that they were bringing in, the MCA was looking particularly at damage stability, and the new regulations were likely to require some major structural alterations to a number of historic craft in order for them to comply. And the Thames barge Cutty, who you can see in this slide, was one of the craft affected, as she operated in the Thames estuary, which is a tidal waterway considered of high traffic density. Now, although this regulatory issue was not fully resolved, National Historic Ships was able to hold a series of meetings with the MCA, which highlighted the potential impact of their proposals on the historic vessel sector. And as a result, there was a shift to reduce some of the categories of craft affected. Next slide, please. Okay, so we move on now to natural challenges. Next, please. And as I mentioned earlier, historic vessels are at much as risk from natural disasters as any other heritage asset. And with many vessels being wooden, fire, of course, is a particular threat. As many of you may know, there's been several awful boatyard fires around the UK in the last few years, which have sadly resulted in some significant losses among our fleet. Back in 2015, we saw a really bad fire at a boatyard in Cowes on the Isle of Wight, as a result of which a number of unique historic vessels were lost. Some of these were in the final stages of conservation, others were actually fully operational. It was heartbreaking. And one of them was the steam pinnace Veer. She was built in 1905. She later became a World War I veteran and then went on to be a Dunkirk little ship in the Second World War. And if we go to the next slide, you will see this is all that was left of her after the fire, which burned so fiercely. Next slide, please. Climate change is also an interesting threat to historic vessels, with rising temperatures and sea levels, unpredictable weather changes, and plastic pollution, just some of the increasing areas of concern. Back in 2009, Cumbria in the Lake District received 316 millimetres of rainfall within a 24-hour period, and this caused major flooding across the district. The 1906 steam launch Shamrock was in her boathouse, where she'd been without problem for the last 30 years, and she had normally over 2 metres of headroom in that boathouse space. But because of this unprecedented rainfall, she was actually crushed against the steel beams in the roof, which caused a major damage to her cabin that had to be completely rebuilt. Next slide, please. And the T-clipper Cutty Sark has also been a victim of natural challenges. Most famously, of course, many of you will remember in the fire, which caught her back in 2007 in the early stages of the conservation project. But actually more recently, with her black topsides and this reflective glass surround, she's been experiencing problems as a result of rising temperatures and extreme heat over the summer, which have resulted in drying out of the decks and the start of fungal growth. Next slide, please. And I mentioned unforeseen challenges briefly earlier in my list. So before we go on to look at sustainability, I wanted to just pause and reflect on the impact that COVID-19 has already had on our sector. Next slide. Passenger carrying craft have been particularly affected. So here we have the family firm Collier's Launches, which owns 4 historic vessels, including the excursion craft Connaught. And they've operated, as some of you may know, for 40 years on the Thames. I believe they carry about 60,000 passengers annually across their vessels. And as a result of COVID, their business was put at high risk, being ineligible for any support grants other than furloughing. Next slide, please. Independent vessel owning museums such as SS Great Britain and the Mary Rose Trust also found themselves at risk because, of course, they had to shut their doors at the busiest time of year, consequently receiving no income. But that doesn't mean that ships don't still go on incurring costs. And in fact, Mary Rose and SS Great Britain, the ships are estimated at costing over 2 million annually just to keep their conservation going. Smaller vessel owning trusts and charities also struggled, having lost their main source of income with the closure of events and day trips. And even private owners have been affected, with obviously having less resources of their own to spend on their craft, but also with the difficulties accessing them to carry out essential maintenance during lockdown. Of course, I could go on, but having labelled this section of the talk the unforeseen, I'm simply going to join with the rest of us in hoping that the new regulations will work and we can slowly overcome this particular challenge, leaving only the other standard difficulties to face.
Oh, Vivian, what are you doing?
Next slide, please.
The floor.
But of course, arguably the biggest challenge of all is sustainability. And even if all the other problems we've talked about can be overcome, the effort is for nothing if a long-term viable plan is not in place for a ship. Next slide, please. So here we have HMS Plymouth. She was a Rothsey-class frigate and a veteran of the Falklands War, which lay in Birkenhead for many years before eventually being scrapped when no realistic future option was found for her. And this is a case of a vessel facing the challenge of being unsustainable. There was no shortage of passion to keep her going, but at 112 metres long, the scale of her meant that millions of pounds would have been needed for her conservation. And other historic ships also had to be taken into consideration, such as HMS Cavalier, 30 years apart, but very similar in nature and already in preservation, or HMS Caroline, the First World War veteran, which was also looking for funding at that time. Next slide, please. And it's important that custodians are able to recognise what is achievable in conservation terms, and when corrosion or dilapidation may have too great a hold, in which case recording and deconstruction or building a replica may be the better choice. A project must also make sense to people so they can see that money is being well spent. So here we have the paddle steamer Ryde, dating from 1936, but seen here in 2007 in a terrible state up the Medina River in Cowes with a collapsed funnel and dilapidated superstructure. And every effort has been made by support groups and individuals over the years to try and save this vessel, but the sum of money needed to do it was great, and the difficulties of finding a viable business plan was high. So Ryde remains at this location today, slowly deteriorating further and pending dismantling, but there is a possible option to save her engine, which is currently considered the most significant surviving part. Next slide, please. And in some cases, it may be that there is no sustainable future for a vessel in one country, but actually there could be in another. And the clipper ship City of Adelaide is a case in point. She lay for many years on a slipway in Irvine, where efforts were made to find a future for her. Eventually, in 2012, she was taken back to Australia, where she'd actually carried some 900 passengers during her working life, from whom many people in the state are now descended. And City of Adelaide is now open to the public as a static exhibit in the Port of Adelaide. Next slide, please. So moving on, at National Historic Ships, what are we doing to help vessel custodians overcome all these challenges and help them deal with the difficult decisions they have to make? Well, back in 2007, we published the first 2 volumes in our guidance series. Next slide, please. Recording and Deconstructing Historic Vessels. These are part of a 3-volume work, Understanding Historic Vessels, and actually we brought out second editions of these earlier this year, which are now freely available to download from our website. And they contain a wealth of information on the latest methodology, as well as a series of case studies to learn from. Next slide, please. In 2010, we published the last volume in the series, Conserving Historic Vessels. This was produced as a hard copy and you can purchase it online through our website. And it's now become an internationally recognised guideline for funders, historic vessel custodians and heritage bodies. Next slide, please. And we support these volumes with our own historic vessel conservation course. And this is a formal qualification. It's accredited by National Historic Ships and it's delivered online through the learning platform Blackboard. And our thinking behind this is to create a specialist knowledge of the unique qualities of historic craft through a series of written assignments. And this improves people's approach to how they conserve their vessels, as well as helping them to produce better long-term plans for them. Next slide, please. As part of our remit, we also offer advice to the National Lottery Heritage Fund and other funding bodies on applications relating to historic vessels or skills projects. And this allows us to offer guidance on vessel significance, but also the viability of a project or its sustainability. And we also work with vessel owners in the early stages of the application process, offering advice and guidance to help them put together a realistic proposal. And we published our own funding guidelines earlier this year, again available through our website. And these are aimed at those seeking funders, but also at the funders themselves to ensure that we're offering the right support to both. Next slide, please. And thinking about the operational challenges, back in 2010, we set up something called the Shipshape Network, which was intended to promote the regeneration of traditional skills, encourage training, and bring together all those with an interest in ship conservation. The network features a directory of skills and services, which lists over 700 companies and individuals offering skills and facilities for historic vessels. It has a jobs page, a crew page, and it also promotes over 85 external maritime projects across the UK. The network's actually due for its 10th birthday this November, and we've planned a week of virtual events, which we hope will reach as wide as an audience as possible via social media. So I hope you'll log on to join us for that. Next slide, please. And we've also sought to bring more young people into the sector to regenerate the pool of skilled individuals. From 2013 to 2016, we ran the Shipshape Heritage Training Partnership Project, which was a lottery-funded scheme, and saw 10 young people undertake a 12-month placement in traditional seamanship skills, learning how to maintain, conserve and operate historic vessels on the register. And we were then successful in securing a second round of funding from the lottery for the SHTP2 project, which has recruited 16 further trainees in either traditional seamanship or museum shipkeeping. And this project has actually just been extended due to COVID, and so it will now finish in September 2021. Next slide, please. And before I end this lecture, I'd like to look at a few success stories. So just considering how some historic vessels have managed to overcome the challenges that we've talked about already and go on to create a successful, sustainable project. Next, please. The Brunel designed passenger vessel SS Great Britain is one of these. So seen here, she was a hulk in the Falkland Islands where she'd rested for approximately 80 years. And just looking at this picture, she was clearly facing some major challenges if she was to survive. Material, organisational, logistical, financial, just to name a few. Next slide, please. But against the odds, a campaign to save her led to her being refloated in 1970 and returned to her original dry dock in Bristol, where a successful museum has now been created around her, and her hull is preserved in a climate-controlled environment. Next slide, please. The Harbour Defence motor launch, HMS Medusa, from the Second World War era, is another example, this time of a smaller operational historic craft, which also faced some major challenges before becoming a viable survivor. The trust that owns her had to secure funding for her conservation, overcome a major fire in the midst of rebuilding her, identify a location where she could be permanently based, find crew to operate her, and also put together a viable business model. And if we go to the next slide, you can see that today she looks like this, a well-managed, well-maintained craft in great condition. Next slide, please. Arguably, preserving a whole collection of vessels is one of the hardest challenges of all. And this is something which Windermere Jetty Museum has achieved in spades. Comprising 40 vessels that tell the story of boating on Lake Windermere from 1780 up to the present day. The museum reopened recently following a £15 million project, largely funded by the National Lottery Heritage Fund. And if you haven't visited yet, it's certainly worth doing so. This image shows Osprey, one of the collection, a 1902 steam launch in mid-conservation. And if we go to the next slide, you can see her as an operational vessel. She's now fully operational again and runs trips every day from the museum pontoon. Next slide, please. And some projects, on the face of it, can appear hopeless and also completely unsustainable, but they may actually have a future after all. And the last surviving landing craft tank in the UK, LCT 7074, Landfall, is a case in point. You can see her here, as I last saw her, sunk at the bottom of Mersey docks, but she was raised against all odds, thanks to a grant from the National Heritage Memorial Fund, and brought back to Portsmouth for conservation. Next slide, please. And very recently, after the conservation was completed, she made her last journey by sea when she was brought round to South Sea seafront in Portsmouth, beached and taken the last few miles to her new home at the D-Day Museum. Next slide, please. And of course, I can't close without mentioning HQS Wellington, the historic vessel which has brought us all here tonight, and which today floats proudly on the embankment and is maintained magnificently by her supporting trust. Acting as the livery hall for the Honourable Company of Master Mariners since 1947, I believe that more than 16,000 people now visit the ship a year for tours, open days and functions. Next slide, please. And while some of the vessels that I've talked about today have met challenges that were too great for them, others have navigated their way successfully through and are now proud survivors with a story to tell. For others, like Balmoral or Calshot, the fight for survival goes on. As their leading body, National Historic Ships continues to work with these craft to help them find a way forward, to document and preserve any vessels which we sadly lose. And all historic vessels face challenges, heightened by the fact that these craft were only built for a finite lifetime, and then we are actually seeking to conserve, display or operate them well beyond this period. And at National Historic Ships, we're only too well aware of the sad truth that we can't save them all, however much our hearts might want to. But understanding the challenges is only half the battle. We also recognise the need to analyse significance carefully, be realistic in our aspirations, and above all, that ensure that a sustainable future has been built into all projects going forwards, so we can keep them alive if we possibly can. So thank you very much for listening. That's the end of the lecture, and I'm more than happy to take any questions that you may have.
Hannah, I'm so grateful. We're all, I'm sure, so grateful for this fascinating talk. It's an enormous subject. It's an enormous challenge for you and for the NHS UK. Why is it that those initials face such large challenges, I wonder? And I just wondered, two questions, if I may, straight off. One is, what do you regard as your greatest challenge and perhaps your greatest achievement? That's the first one. And the second one is, are you swamped with demand for assistance, advice, financial advice, whatever it may be? In other words, is the supply, if I may put it, of the existence of these ships that need conserving, is it still running on and on and on? Or are we actually seeing these wonderful old vessels, large and small, disappear and nothing really to replace them?
Yeah, some good questions there. Thanks, Alistair. If I go with the first one first, sorry, could you just repeat the
sure.
first question?
Yes, your greatest challenge and your greatest achievement, if that's not an unfair question.
No, not at all. I think probably the greatest achievement actually for us at National Historic Ships since when we started would be getting the buy-in from the sector to what we do. So when I first started working for National Historic Ships back in 2007, I was a consultant and I did quite a lot of outreach work. So I would go out and visit the vessels, meet the owners, tell them about the work of National Historic Ships and also update our records for the database. And I met with quite a bit of suspicion. I think there was a feeling that, you know, we were going to come and legislate around these vessels. We were going to tell them what to do and how to care for their vessels, which of course was very far from the case. But it took a while for people to actually realise within the sector that we were on their side. And as soon as they did realise that and they started to see that, you know, we could fight their corner, we could promote them, we could advise them, we could do everything to support them, that we are the intermediary between the funding bodies and the government, you know, that was a massive sea change. And suddenly the sector was behind us, they needed us, they wanted us. And that was, you know, that was a massive achievement, I think, just turning people's preconceptions around.
I would agree.
And in terms of challenges for us, I think I'd probably have to go with the obvious one, which is cuts to funding. So we do have a very small annual grant from DCMS, which we're very lucky to have. But since we were set up in 2006, we've obviously taken cuts in line with every other public sector body. So we do have diminishing resources. And, you know, if that continues, then we will get to a point where obviously it will have an impact on the services we provide. So the challenge for us is continuously fundraising to find different ways to continue delivering our projects.
Well, it is an enormous task, and you're not exactly a large organisation, are you, as well, in terms of personnel? So you must be kept extremely busy.
No, that's right. Yeah, no, I have a small team of very hard-working team of 6 individuals plus a volunteer. So yeah, there's not very many of us, but yeah, a little bit extra funding wouldn't go amiss.
I do congratulate you, and we will make sure that here on the Wellington, we will make sure that everyone is aware of you. I think it's important.
Thank you. That's kind. And turning to your other question, do we have an inexhaustible supply of vessels banging on our door looking for help? I think certainly at the moment we do, because you know, we do have about 2,000 vessels that are on our databases that we work with. You know, as we've said, it's a small team, so you know, we're getting daily requests for support or help. But we do, because we have this rolling age criteria, you know, there's always more vessels that will continually come onto the register as they reach the 50-year limit. So it does feel like there is a bit of a, you know, constant supply and demand, even though sadly we are losing some vessels at the same time. And then I think because we also deal with the maritime infrastructure, so we get requests, you know, for maritime skills projects or, you know, to advise on related maritime heritage projects that may not directly involve a vessel. So there's sort of a constant, you know, a constant flow of new work.
Yeah. Well, I think it's a challenge which will go on and on and on, and I hope. We are a maritime nation, and I think actually more people should be made aware of this, and I think there are ways that perhaps, hopefully, as I said, we can help to do that for you as well. If I may, thank you very much. We'll speak further. Are you okay to take just 1 or 2 more questions, maybe? I know it's running rather late, and mea culpa because of our technical problems. But
that's absolutely fine.
I know that Jenny has been hopefully finding 1 or 2 furthers. Jenny, may I hand over to you? Jenny Mosley, our marketing trustee.
Yes, thank you very much, Alistair, and thank you so much, Hannah. I will tell you that I've received a lot of comments on your presentation. Clap, clap is one. Fascinating and absorbing. Thank you, Hannah, on behalf of RNVRYC. I will wish you all the best. Robin Payne in New Zealand. Well done, Hannah. Unfortunately, I have to move on to the next event here in New Zealand. So it sounds as if it's been a great success. Another question that's come in is, what is National Historic Ships doing to support the sector and mitigate the impact of COVID-19 at this challenging time?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question, and obviously something that we're all dealing with at the moment. So I think from our point of view, very much from day one of lockdown, we saw ourselves as a point of liaison. So there was quite a lot of work gathering data about the impact that COVID was having on our sector. I think we gathered data on over 100 vessel owning organisations. And then we submitted that as a formal response to the DCMS Select Committee hearing. We also got a COVID resources page up on our website pretty much straight away, so that we were able to update people on the latest regulations and advice and guidance. And we've had a role feeding queries from historic vessels directly back to DCMS through the Heritage Working Group, which is chaired by the Minister, and that meets on a weekly basis. The other thing that we've looked at doing as much as we can is to help vessels directly through our own small grants scheme. So we do have sustainability grants that we give out. They're relatively low level, up to £1,000 each. But using the savings that we've made as an organisation throughout COVID, so by not travelling around the UK, by not holding events or visiting vessels, we ploughed all those savings back into that small grant scheme, so that we were actually able to give out £10,000 in grants earlier this summer. Again, a relatively small sum compared with, you know, the amounts that we're seeing coming through now through the Cultural Recovery Fund and other measures like that. But you know, for some vessels, it's proving a bit of a lifeline.
Thank you. And another one from, hold on, it's just gone off of my screen. Another question. From Jess Clay, great talk and nice to see you, Hannah. The last 12 months have enabled us trainees to see firsthand the amazing projects around the country and the challenges they face. I worry that so many of the projects rely on aid, funding and volunteers. Do you think there is a need for organisations to stand on their own 2 feet? And if so, how?
Thanks, Jenny. Yeah, that's a good question. It's actually come in through one of our shipshape trainees at the project I spoke to you about in the lecture. So really nice to hear from you, Jess. And I think it's a good question. And I think it goes right back to what I was saying about sustainability. So, you know, vessels can be lucky enough to get a lot of support through the lottery or through other funding bodies. But actually, you know, that will get them through perhaps the conservation of a project. But if they don't have that long-term business plan in place, and the vessel's not able to generate its own income, then, you know, it will fall at that hurdle and it will be back begging for more funding again, you know, as soon as that initial input of funding's run out, and that can become a sort of never-ending circle. So yes, I think it's really important that vessels do get those long-term plans in place, and I think that's what all the guidance we're putting together is trying to help them to do. You know, I think there's more that we can do as well to kind of inform and help people to understand what they need to do and get that long-term planning in place. And actually, hopefully, a lot of the digital tools that are coming out with free webinars and things like that will provide the mechanism for us to get that information out to the wider sector.
Thank you very much. They're coming in thick and fast now, and we're running out of time. I'll ask you one question from Amel that came in very early. What has happened to HMS President that was docked beside the Wellington?
Yes, the President, yeah, Wellington's neighbour, of course, on the embankment. Well, she had to move, I believe, because of works that were happening on the embankment, and she went down to Chatham Docks, where I believe she is now still based. She has been taken on by a new individual owner, and I know that they've had some volunteers on board trying to do some work to the ship. So hopefully we will hear a more positive story coming from her at some point in the future. And you can keep up to date with that and with any of the historic vessels by looking up their entries on our website. There's a keyword search by vessel name, or checking into our news page.
Thank you very much. Next slide, please, Alistair.
Right, here we go. With a bit of luck.
Thank you.
Yeah.
A little advertisement from me as marketing trustee of the Wellington Trust. 2 more lectures booked now on Zoom. 9th of November, Dr. Paul Stott, Senior Lecturer, School of Engineering at Newcastle University. Whatever happened to our shipbuilding industry? And that's the annual Shipwrights Lecture. And 14th of December, John Johnson Allen, many of you know him and he's in our audience tonight, liveryman of HCMM and chairman of the Institute of Seamanship, the Cruise of the Orpheus, the Royal Tour of 1901, the Institute of Seamanship Lecture. We're going to be sending you details in due course, and we hope you'll join us again. And remember, if you have enjoyed this evening's lecture, any donation, however small, to the preservation of HQS Wellington is much appreciated, and the link will be on the presentation when you get it. Over to you to say thank you.
Well, a thank you, a very big thank you, if I may start again with you, Hannah. Putting up with those major technical issues at the beginning where you were trying to come in and we couldn't see you. Was a major start. I think the way you've delivered this lecture against that background, let alone anything else, has been extraordinary. You've covered enormous ground, as I said, and really rekindled, I think, in a number of people's minds, the importance of the role you have to play. Someone has to coordinate what happens with these small ships and large ships. It's very sad on a personal note to see the Plymouth go. A great friend of mine, who was godfather to one of my children, it happened, was in the Falklands in the Plymouth, and she was one of the ships that was moored in Carlos water and was attacked by the Argentinian Air Force while the Bluff Cove evacuation was taking place. So she has her own story to tell. It's sad she's no longer there, but one can understand it. You have really kindled it, certainly in my mind, interest on this again, and we must follow it through. I think I'm sure that your organization now is on 91 people's minds anyway. And as you say, with your kind permission, we're going to actually let people share the recording of this event afterwards. And so there'll be a whole load of other people, hopefully will get to hear about what the NHS UK has to offer. Do, by the way, people, if you'd like to, turn on your videos at this stage. We'll perhaps say not sound, because it will sound like a turkey house at Christmas, but in a very appropriate way. The next lectures Jenny has told you about, there will be further lectures in the new year. All that information we can give to you if you are happy that we might retain your names, and we'll be writing to you after this just to say, would you like us to put it on the register? We're very aware of legislation of not having your name there if you don't want it there. But we can certainly keep you up to date with the events, and also hopefully with a number of other things going on with the ship, including getting her back to a stage where we can get general public and schools back on board. May I also extend my thanks to the home team, to you, Jenny Mosley, to you, Fiona Sparks, our manager, and particularly, if I might say tonight, Matt Edgar, to you as our website and technical manager. You dealt with us very calmly, which managed to keep me almost under control, which is great. I'd also like to extend, and Steve and Diana are both there. None of this would, as they say, be possible without you, Stephen. Captain Stephen Taylor, RN, retired, was our chairman of the Wellington Trust. And through Stephen Taylor and Glyn Evans, one of the members of the HCMM, this whole series of lectures started some time ago and has continued very successfully. We get some really interesting topics that come in, and some you would never think of, and you think, well, do I want to spend time listening? and you're always glad you do, because I think our whole maritime experience in this country is quite remarkable and unusual, particularly if you bear in mind that 96% of cargo comes by sea to this country and goes out. And finally, I'd like to thank all of you, the remaining 54 out of our audience of 91 tonight, for coming on board. And I do apologize yet again for the technical hitch at the beginning. I hope next time, if we see you here, that won't be happening. So by all means, many thanks, Hannah. Let's turn on the sound, if we may, and see if we can applaud in the usual way.